Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest.
The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it. And they've done a good job of it, but now I'm president.
February 27th, 2025, So Europe is Our Enemy Now edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. I'm joined from New Haven, Connecticut, from the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School by Emily Bazelon. Hello, Emily Bazelon. You've lost a lot of your overhead budget in the last year. Indirect costs, squeezing the Bazelon household there.
LOL. Good morning.
She didn't really lean into that. She was a great economy of response.
Her sweater is a little rattier.
Oh, you're going to mock my sweater. You know.
She's lost 40% of her sweater, apparently. Then from New York City, John Dickerson, the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News and the host or / anchor of CBS Evening News Plus. Hello, John.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the ships at sea.
This week on the Gabfest, the transatlantic alliance that has protected the free world for the last 80 years seems to be over. We are going to talk to the Economist editor-in-chief, Zanny Minton Beddoes, about what is happening in Europe, what is happening to Europe, and what the consequences for the world are going to be. Then the House passed a budget framework. Can a real budget come out of it? Does it make sense? What kind of damage to the poor and help for the rich will come out of this budget if it does pass? Then the showdown between Donald Trump and the media. Donald Trump seems to be winning. He's certainly causing a crisis of confidence and of activity in the press in Washington, D.C. What does it mean for the future of the First Amendment and for the future of the media in the United States, for our business? Plus, of course, we'll have cocktail chatter. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Zanny Minton Beddoes is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. The Economist, in my mind, is... If Winston Churchill and Ronald Reagan had a baby, it would be The Economist. It is the paper embodiment of the transatlantic alliance that has been the steadying force of the last century. And Zanny joins us from London in a week when the sort of fundamental premises of that alliance are being questioned by the Trump administration. The Trump administration is, of course, parroting Vladimir Putin's talking points about Ukraine, extorting Ukraine to sign a mineral deal with an offer they couldn't refuse, lecturing European leaders about free speech, and causing the French and British leaders to hustle to D.C. to pay court to the president. Zanny, Anne Applebaum wrote in The Atlantic this week that we're at the end of the post-war world, the end of something fundamental. Has something fundamentally changed with this Trump administration, or is it just a kind of, it's a little bit of a chaotic reset?
Well, hi, David. It's great to join you. I completely agree with Anne. Something fundamental has changed. The transatlantic alliance, the post-war global order, all these phrases that people like us have talked about for a long time, I think it really is now coming to an end, or at least certainly can't be relied on. I think the difference with Trump 1, when there was also a lot of kind of quite wild rhetoric, was that I think people in Europe convinced themselves that maybe this was an aberration and the US would go back to being the kind of normal, reliable transatlantic partner. And this time around, I think there's a really powerful recognition in Europe that the US at best can no longer be relied on, and at worst is actively hostile to Europe. And I think we've seen a number of things in the last few weeks. I was at the Munich Security Conference, that international security Gabfest, a couple of weekends ago, when Vice President J.D. Vance rather than, delivering a speech about Ukraine, which everyone was expecting, essentially delivered a broadside against Europeans and Europeans' supposed lack of free speech and real democracy. And he talked about being worried about the enemy within in Europe. And I was sitting I was at the back of the room, next to a couple of Germans who were visibly shocked by this. I mean, people just were incredibly taken aback. And then, of course, that was the day after Defense Secretary Hegseth had essentially indicated that, the US may be moving out of Europe, although that was walked back by other members of the Trump administration. And then you've had, as you said, President Trump calling President Zelensky a dictator. You've had him essentially parroting talking points from Vladimir Putin. And you've had, a negotiation with the Ukrainians that really is, more akin to that of a mobster, which is why last week we put on our cover in Europe a picture of a long table with Vladimir Putin and President Trump at one end and nobody else in all the seats. And we called it Europe's worst nightmare. And this week's cover has a scene reminiscent of Reservoir Dogs with the Don at the front, and it's called, the Don's New World Order. And we're really looking at what will international relations be like in a world that is not a world where alliances matter, but where transactions matter, a world that is more akin to a kind of protection racket and mobster behavior, where everything is up for grabs, everything is a deal, whether it's territory, whether it's resources, a world where might is right, and where it does seem as though the president of the United States is kind of, rather taken with dictators much more than with democracies. I mean, he said just a couple of days ago that the European Union was, I quote, created to screw the United States. This is an extraordinary language from the president of the United States for those of us sitting in Europe.
What do you expect Europe to do in response? I mean, it's not easy for European separate countries to have a united response. They're not really set up for that. And in this world, we may be entering of might versus right, that seems to me like an increasing weakness. So, I see that some individual countries have talked about increasing defense spending and trying to stand up for Ukraine. But it seems like Europe has to present a more united front in order to succeed in this new order.
Absolutely, Emily, it does. And this is a moment that I think shows up a lot of Europe's weaknesses. The first is that actually beneath the bluster, President Trump makes a few very good points. And he made this in his first term, and he's making it again. The Europeans do not spend enough money on defense. It is absolutely true that the Europeans have for too long been used to a security relationship where the bulk of that security comes from the United States. And as the United States thinks more about threats in the Pacific, it's of course right that the Europeans should be spending more, and they haven't been. And it's, the invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up moment, and Chancellor Scholz, the outgoing Chancellor of Germany, gave a speech in the German parliament where he talked about a Zeitenwende, a transformation of the times, and you thought maybe that was the moment when Europe woke up, and defense spending did increase. But this time around, I think it's really hit home. The question is whether European politicians can translate their recognition of the magnitude of the moment into action. And I think there's two problems. The first, as you say, is that Europe is not united, and it is a constellation of countries. And, Henry Kissinger famously was said to say, I don't know who to call in Europe when I want to call Europe. And that is kind of a problem. Who's going to be the European at the table? It's hard to know exactly who it should be. Increasingly, I think you're seeing that President Macron, who was in Washington earlier this week, and Prime Minister Starmer are taking a lead. I think Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, almost certainly incoming chancellor of Germany, has spoken very toughly. But the lack of unity, or at least the lack of organizational unity, is one problem. And the second is, I think this is a really big problem for European leaders, that I'm not sure Europe's populations have been prepared for the scale of change that is going to be needed in really increasing defense. I mean, the UK this week is an interesting example. Keir Starmer, in advance of coming to Washington, clearly thinking about how do you present President Trump with a win, announced an acceleration of the increase in defense spending in Britain. So Britain currently spends about 2.3% of GDP, we're going to accelerate getting to 2.5% by 2027, which is faster than they were planning to. And then there's a promise of more after that. That was a big shift. He's done it by gutting the foreign aid budget. And that's been sort of, top of the news here in the UK all week. But I'm just not sure that even in the UK, people have really got to grips with what it means to fund that kind of increase in defense spending over time. And that's a public debate about the threat that Europe faces in Russia, the risks that are now exist on the transatlantic alliance. These are big, big changes. And we're only just getting to the stage where I think politicians are beginning to level with their populations on what that means.
Zanny, does anybody in Europe have leverage over the United States or Trump, whether it's in trade relations or intelligence sharing or anything that might reset the conversation on terms that are more favorable to either an individual member or Europe in general? Or is the larder so empty that basically you have to come with things in hand to pay feasance to the Don?
No, I think the Europeans do have leverage. And I think actually, people are beginning to learn how to play the game. And you are going to, you've had, I think the initial reaction amongst European politicians was a sort of pearl clutching, I can't believe this is happening moment. We are in Europe, we care about rules and institutions and we don't think like this kind of mobster transactionalism. But I think if that really is the way the world is going, the Europeans will play the game too. And that is both in tactical terms. I think everyone is learning on this side of the Atlantic that you need to present what you want to President Trump as a win for him. And so that's a mixture of flattery. It's a mixture of framing something that a direction you want to go in a way that he thinks it's a win for him. That's a sort of tactic that Europeans are learning fast. And if you saw the press conference with Emmanuel Macron, I think he was playing it rather well. I mean, we can learn to do that. But the second is that Europe, and more sort of importantly, Europe does have assets. And if we're going to get into a world, which I think Europeans wouldn't choose, but a world of transactions, of deals where you bring assets to the table, Europe has a lot of them. Yes, Europe doesn't spend enough on defense, but actually America's ability to project its power, its military power, depends on, for example, bases in Europe. Ramstein Air Base is extremely important. Europe is a large consumer market. If there are, enormous tariffs put in place by the United States, which is obviously President Trump is threatening, the Europeans can effectively retaliate. European companies make important parts of the kind of tech supply chain. If we are going into this kind of game, the Europeans are certainly not without assets of their own. The Five Eyes intelligence operation depends on Europe in part too. So it's not as though Europe has nothing to bring to the table, and certainly not if it's acting collectively.
Zanny, I want to switch the focus a little bit. You've been describing a Europe which I think is a Europe of liberal democracies. How vulnerable do you think the big countries of Europe are to the sort of fascist-scented populism that Trump is trying here? We saw the German elections this week where the party that was most Trumpist did kind of at the level everyone expected, but not better. Do you feel like that the tide of nationalist, right-wing, anti-immigrant, vaguely fascist parties has reached its peak, or is there still, could a France be ruled by somebody like Donald Trump as opposed to a Macron?
So I think the rise of the populist right has been and is a fundamental part of what's going on in European politics. And yes, it could go further. And it's driven in Europe by many of the factors that you would recognize in the US, particularly immigration and particularly concerns about immigration. And it's driven by frustrations with, kind of wokeness broadly. The origins are not dissimilar. And the frustration with the status quo and the kind of collapse, actually, and you see this both in France and Germany. To simplify just a little, those two countries essentially were dominated by center-right and center-left parties for almost all the post-war era. They were completely dominant. And you've now seen a fragmentation in those political systems. So you have more parties and as a result, a kind of somewhat less predictable constellation and growing support, still minority, but growing support for the populist right. And in many countries in Europe, populist hard right parties are now part of governing coalitions. In Germany, given its history, there's been what's called the sort of firewall approach, that none of the mainstream parties will work with the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. And it's actually, interestingly, that was, as you know, one of the things that Vice President Vance railed about in his speech at the Munich Security Conference. He argued that it was undemocratic that 20% of the population was effectively had its vote not represented. And I think I do think there's a legitimate debate to be had about whether the best way of dealing with the populist right is to kind of try and have a firewall as the Germans do, or whether it is to, integrate it. But the underlying problem, which is what Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, said very clearly, was that unless the issues that the populist right are worried about are addressed in Europe, and I think migration is particularly one of them, this pressure will keep on rising. So there are a lot of parallels. It's not yet. I think there's certainly an uncomfortable chance that you have a Marine Le Pen as president of France. I don't know what. I'm not going to put odds on it, but it would be foolish to rule it out.
I want to try out for you this framing, which maybe is oversimplified, but we've been talking about it and I've been thinking about a lot, which is that at least in the United States, when the share of people who are born outside the country rises above 15 or 20% for, more than a century, there's been a big backlash, and you end up with immigration restrictions and a lot of xenophobia and othering and move toward the populist right. Obviously in some European countries like Germany, the percentage I think also is now around 20%, which is unusual in Europe. Can the more moderate, non-hard right politicians address this by simply lowering immigration, kind of taking a moderate step back? Or, is this a kind of more existential development that's going on, especially given as, climate change and other pressures make it seem like there are lots of reasons for people to want to move around the world?
So I think you put your finger on something really fundamental, that I think there is a pace of immigration that ultimately becomes kind of politically unsustainable. It's what we saw in the late 19th century in the US. I'm not sure I would put a number on it. You're braver than I am at whether it hits at 15% or wherever, but the phenomenon is definitely right. But I think there's sort of two components to the phenomenon. One is the number of migrants, and the second is the sort of sense of disorder or lack of control over the border. And I think it's worth thinking that even in the United States, it was not just the number of people that came in the last 4 years under the Biden administration, but the sense of loss of control over the border and the sense of inability to control that flow. And I think certainly in Europe, that latter part is the more important driver. It's actually not just or not only the number of migrants. It's the way in which within Europe, where they're in the European Union, or at least most of the countries, there was this Schengen agreement and people could cross borders without papers and so forth. There was a sense that there was no control over it. Or here in this country, people are very exercised in the UK about people crossing the channel on small boats to seek asylum. It's a relatively small number of people, actually. But nonetheless, the sense of disorder and chaos that engenders is a lot of what is driving the popular backlash. So I think it's a little more complicated than just sort of a rule that if the number rises to a certain percentage, you're in trouble. The reason I raise that is because in Europe, where the population is aging very fast, and where there's going to be a real demographic need, like a country like Germany is going to have a huge shortage of skilled workers very soon because the population is aging. There's going to be a massive sort of cliff of retirement. So ironically, at the same time as the AfD is doing very well by preying on people's fears of uncontrolled migration, Germany is going to be trying to attract particularly skilled migrants if it wants to sustain its manufacturing sector. And that's a kind of interesting and quite difficult balance, I think, for any politician to strike. Because if Europe doesn't have migration, particularly countries like Italy and Germany, if they don't have any migration, they're going to be in real trouble because there's just going to be a massive collapse in the workforce relative to the size of the population of retirees.
which mirrors a problem that is existing in the States. I have 18,000 questions for you, Zanny, but I'll have to ask this one because we're running out. But we should talk about Ukraine. The way it looks like it's ending, what do you think Europe or individual countries in Europe are going to have to basically accept in this deal that's being worked out with, either Trump and Putin, or Trump-Putin with Zelensky to the side? What might they have to accept? And is that possible in both strategically, but also in terms of Europe's sense of itself and what it has or should have control over, or at least a say in?
So I would start by saying, I think we're still a very long way from a deal. Even though President Trump has been, shifting towards Vladimir Putin's talking points, despite the outreach, despite what I would see as the kind of unilateral sort of handing over of lots of chips on the table by the United States. If you actually listen to what Foreign Minister Lavrov in Moscow say, or even Vladimir Putin, it's not at all clear that they are, willing to concede anything very much yet. So I think we're quite a long way from a ceasefire or a deal. But I think the contours of what a good outcome would be have been clear for a while, actually. I mean, lots of people, including us, but including many other people, have argued for a long time that the stated goals of the Ukrainians, which is to go back to their 2014 borders, was, not going to be possible. I think anybody who's been there, and I was last there in September, and I went to the east, close to the front line, can see that the notion of pushing the Russians back is all but implausible in the short term. So there was always going to be something that involved loss of territory. But what the Ukrainians need, and what sort of, most people who thought where the outcome would be want, is a security guarantee that ensures that Vladimir Putin doesn't come back and start again anytime soon and reinvade. And so I think what the question that the Europeans have is not, should there be a ceasefire? Will the Ukrainians lose some territory, either in practice or de jure? They will. The question is, what's the nature of the security guarantee that the Ukrainians need to deter Vladimir Putin? And I think Keir Starmer, when he's talking to President Trump this week, is going to be trying to impress upon President Trump the importance of a credible security guarantee. And the real challenge for the Europeans, I think they know they're going to have to spend more, pay for most or all of it. They're talking about sending some troops to Ukraine as some sort of a peacekeeping force. But everyone knows that this is not credible without a US backstop. And Vladimir Putin definitely knows that. So the real question now, I think, and the sort of dividing line between whether President Trump sells out Ukraine or whether this is a reasonable ceasefire, is the nature of that security guarantee that the US will have to backstop for it to be credible.
Zanny Minton Beddoes is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Zanny, thanks for coming on the Gabfest today.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Mint Mobile. It is important to keep your money where you can see it. That's why it's time to say bye-bye to crazy high wireless bills, bogus fees, and quote-unquote free perks that actually cost more in the long run. So have a look at Mint Mobile. Even Slate's president, Charlie Kammerer, is using Mint Mobile. And Charlie says more people should be trying Mint out. It was really easy to switch providers. The SIM card was shipped to Charlie's home. They let him use his existing phone. He didn't have to change his number. And he's saving a ton of money because he's on the $15 a month deal and getting unlimited talk and text over their 5G network at literally a fraction of what he was paying with one of the other guys. So if you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/Gabfest. That's mintmobile.com/Gabfest. Upfront payment of $45 for a 3-month 5 gigabyte plan required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by UpFirst. If you're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook or X or TikTok, you might need a break from news fatigue. UpFirst can free you from the all-day scroll and tell you everything you need to know in an easy 15 minutes. NPR's UpFirst provides the top 3 news stories to start your day in digestible 10 to 15-minute episodes. It's all the news you need so you can get back to your day feeling informed while preserving your sanity. Up first is the go-to daily habit for news consumers who want to stay informed, but are forever strapped for time. The short format makes it easy to catch up on what's happening while you're making breakfast or getting ready for work. And Up first has the 1-2 punch, the devastating 1-2 punch of being short and thorough, national and international, fact-based and personable. With Up First, you can start your day a little more in the know than when you went to sleep. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Trade Coffee. Starting your day with a fresh cup of coffee is a ritual for most. It is not a ritual for me. It is a law for me. So level up your morning routine with Trade. Every bag of Trade coffee is roasted to order, and they offer a coffee subscription service that delivers freshly roasted coffee straight to your door. I have Juggernaut coffee in my coffee maker right now from Trade. It's delicious. I'm a kind of dark, but not super dark roast guy. That's the compromise that my girlfriend and I have reached. We're right in between dark and super dark. And Juggernaut is delicious. In fact, it's so delicious that I had a house guest the other day, a very discerning, sophisticated house guest. And he said to me, "This coffee is delicious." And I could say with pride, it was Juggernaut. Trade's experts have taste tested thousands of coffees to curate over 450 amazing roasts. So whether you're new to coffee or know your favorites, they will handpick the perfect coffee for you. You take their quiz, takes less than a minute, and they'll match you with your perfect coffee. If that first bag isn't quite right, no problem. Trade will replace it for free until they nail it. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering Gabfest listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/Gabfest. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/Gabfest for 40% off your first order. drinktrade.com/Gabfest. The House passed with 217 votes to 215 votes, all Republican votes minus one, no Democratic votes, a budget resolution that will now be the framework of what President Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson hope will be a big and beautiful budget. The resolution is not a budget. All the details effectively have been left out of it. It's the broad strokes. So it's to retain the Trump 2017 tax cuts, which is $4 trillion worth of cost, worth of increased expense to the country. Don't touch defense. Take $2 trillion in federal spending out of everything else, most of which is going to come from Medicaid and food stamps, but a lot of it's going to come just from the heart and soul of the EPA, the HHS, Department of Education, Department of Transportation, everything else that does the federal government's business, which we've seen in recent weeks. The Trump administration is extremely ready to tear down to the studs. So, John, first of all, I guess let's talk about this budget resolution and how it got passed. Is it a surprise that Speaker Mike Johnson got this framework passed?
On the one hand, you could say, not a surprise at all. The Republican Party is marching in lockstep with the president. The president wanted this. And so they jump to what he wants. And particularly, he wants the House bill, the big bill that puts all of his requests into a single bill. So on the one hand, you could say that. On the other hand, the margin is very, very small in the House. Johnson could only lose 2 votes. And there are conflicting pressures. You've got moderates and moderate Republicans who worry about the kinds of cuts that you described, David. And then you've got conservatives who don't think there are enough cuts, and even some who say that the $4.5 trillion in extending the Trump tax cuts from 2015 is too much of a budget buster. And they don't want it all necessarily made up for by cuts, because they know that unless you go into some of the bigger programs like Social Security and Medicare or the Pentagon budget, that there's no way you can make up for the revenue lost as a result of the tax cuts. So he had these two factions, and particularly the people who call themselves budget hawks, will not vote for a resolution and have not in the past and have caused trouble. So it was certainly possible that this could all fail. So it is a victory for Johnson, but embeds all kinds of challenges, which we'll talk about, which are impossible to square using the terms and words that have come to signify actually meaningful things, which is to say the only way they can get this done is by pulling a sleight of hand somewhere.
Before we get to some of the details in this, can you just explain for those of us I mean, I totally understand reconciliation. Like, don't get me wrong. I 100% understand reconciliation. But can you just explain to maybe some of the ignorant people out there what it is that reconciliation is and how what the path they're choosing allows them potentially to pass this whole thing without Democratic votes?
Reconciliation is mostly a Senate thing, which is it's a way to do tax and spending legislation where you only have to meet a 50-vote threshold. You don't have to worry about the filibuster. But there are some constraints on that. One of them is the so-called Byrd rule, which says that you can't have extraneous non-budgetary legislation that's a part of a reconciliation. And then secondarily, the numbers have to, you can't, I believe this is true, can't add to the deficit outside of the budget window. And when you do, which is, I think, the original reason the Trump tax cuts expire, because they, and this is true of a lot, they do this, this has been done a lot in history, which is provisions expire when the window hits in order to make the math work, in order to allow a reconciliation to go forward. And so it's faster in one sense, but we'll hear a lot of conversation about the parliamentarian and the constraints of using this process as the Senate goes through its business of trying to make these numbers add up. Among the other rules of reconciliation, as I understand them in the budget process, is that once a budget resolution is agreed to by the House and Senate, the targets for each individual committee are set. So the $880 billion in savings that's supposed to be found under the House budget resolution in the Energy and Commerce Committee is a target that they have to hit under the rules of reconciliation. And so there's been a lot of concern about that number because the Energy and Commerce Committee can't find savings in the programs that it oversees unless savings of that size, unless it takes it out of Medicaid. The numbers just don't add up. And the fact that it has to hit that target and is compelled to is a part of the constraints of the reconciliation process.
And just to note that if they wanted to, they could pass a budget which added $50 trillion to the deficit, but they would have to get it passed. That would have to go through a normal budget process and it would require getting Democratic votes for it.
Could they also just axe the role of the parliamentarian and just do it differently if they wanted to? Or is there a question of whether that would itself have to be approved through the filibuster?
They'd have to suspend Byrd rule, which essentially says that anything can be blocked that is extraneous to the basic purpose of the reconciliation, which is budget changes. So they can't get past some stuff without the they would have to remove rules, and I don't think you can do that in the Senate without unanimous consent.
Emily, I think as a matter of pure political bravado, this is obviously a great moment for Trump and for the Republicans. Then you get to sort of the details of what they're proposing to do. And it is a huge boon to the rich, extending the Trump tax cuts, which overwhelmingly benefit the wealthiest portion of Americans. And to do that, and to keep this even pretending to be in line with the rules that John just laid out about not extending the deficit too much, they have to make these cuts. And the cuts they're proposing include $880 billion over the next 10 years that has to come essentially from Medicaid, Medicare, the money that's being spent on Medicaid and Medicare. And Trump has already said, we're not going to touch Medicare because that's old people, so we don't dare mess with them. So it's going to come primarily probably out of Medicaid, which is a huge slash to one of the key social safety nets and benefits that the United States provides to poorer people, right?
Exactly. There are more than 70 million people who now receive Medicaid. It's become a larger pool because of the funding in the Affordable Care Act. And it seems like the main thing on the chopping block. I wanted to, if you don't mind, quarrel with something you said a few minutes ago, which is that a lot of these potential savings could come out of gutting the federal government. Yes, they would love to tear down the federal government to its studs, but you can't get that much money out of doing that because it just isn't that much a percentage of the budget, even if you got rid of every single agency. So these cuts to social welfare programs, to Medicaid, food stamps, whatever else they decide to target are going to be the main way that they fund tax breaks for the rich. Like, that is absolutely the trade here.
Right. And the food stamps, looks to be about $250 billion over the next 10 years coming out of the Department of Agriculture, most of which people think will come out of food stamps. That's a huge amount of money, which is in a program which benefits certainly tens, maybe even more than 100 million Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it just is taking from the poor to feed the rich. It's a Robin Hood, an anti-Robin Hood kind of move, and they can try to dress it up however they want. They haven't said yet that the cuts are coming from Medicaid. And there are a small number of Republicans in the House who seem squeamish about this and the way it's going to affect their own constituents. So I think one question will be what kind of pressure Democrats and other opponents of these cuts can bring to bear on those particular members of Congress and maybe any Republican senators who feel like they could be vulnerable.
This is the place in a moment where if people feel like the democratic process is under threat based on the moves that the president is taking and his open flouting of a lot of not only norms but laws and judicial interpretations, this is the one place where representatives do respond to pressure, or should, and the thin margin in the House should make this an instance in which public outcry and public pressure and all the things that are supposed to work in a democracy, it is the one place it can work, even though obviously a situation in which there is no bipartisan discussion between the two sides about spending is not the optimum operation of the way to set priorities, which is what you do through a budget process.
There's this hilarious quote from a Republican congressman from New York, Mike Lawler, represents a district that's sort of a swingish district, and he said, Trump promised he would not allow Medicaid to be cut. The president was clear about that. I was clear about that. And so that's why Lawler said he voted for the resolution. Like, Lawler obviously knows that Medicaid is going to be cut. Like, no honest person could look at this and say, oh, yes, our conclusion is we're going to cut $2 trillion out of federal spending, but, not a penny that's going to come out of Medicaid. Come on.
Well, and one of the important things to watch with the Medicaid conversation, and also just the larger question about what does and doesn't affect the deficit, and this matters again because of the restrictions in the Senate that require that the math work out in such a way that the deficit isn't added to outside of the budget window, which is 10 years. They're going to change terms. They're going to do so. For example, with Medicaid, you could talk about sort of block granting to the states. So we're not cutting Medicaid. We're going to send the money all to the states. And this is not actually something I've read, but it's one of the things they tried to do, for example, with the replacement of the Affordable Care Act was say, we're not cutting anything. We're just sending this back to the states, and the states can make their funding decisions about healthcare, because closer to the people, they'll find all these savings and it'll be great. But the opposite argument was essentially you block grant it back to the states, and it is effectively a cut because there's no way a state can come up with the kind of savings to cover enough people with the amount of money that they are being given. So things like that can happen where somebody can say, we're not cutting it, we're just giving power back to the states, when effectively It is a cut. Right. One other tiny thing to watch for is when they do the math, there is some reporting that the House and Senate are going to use the current budget baseline to basically waive away the cost, the $4.5 trillion cost of extending the Trump tax cuts, which expire in part because in previous budgets they had to keep up with these rules about adding to the deficit in the future. So they're going to set the baseline as if those tax cuts had already been voted for and extended, which basically, for the purposes of this accounting, disappears the 4.5. It doesn't disappear the effect of the 4.5 trillion. It doesn't disappear the budget effects, but it does for the purposes of this hoop you have to jump through to get the math to work in order to allow it to pass the parliamentarian and be voted on. I mean, it's a total sleight of hand, which it appears is one of the ways they might get around some of these budget challenges.
John, do you think the fact that Trump's approval rating is falling and there's starting to be these signs of shaky consumer confidence is going to have an effect on these negotiations?
Yes. So who won't buy into the current baseline sleight of hand is the bond market and is the actual economy. As you mentioned, the consumer confidence numbers for February took the largest 1 month drop in 3.5 years. Why? Because consumers think two things. One, inflation is going up more even than they thought it would, and more than the Fed thinks it will. And they're uncertain about Donald Trump's tariffs. So the president elected largely on the basis, or maybe wholly on the basis, of a bad economy has really done nothing to address people's concerns about the economy. And in fact, to the extent he's done anything, it's made those concerns worse by adding tariffs, which people recognize overwhelmingly in polls, because people aren't dumb, that tariffs are a tax on them, and that it'll show up in increased prices in some place. And while you can make a case for increasing American manufacturing as a result of tariffs and that kind of thing, the benefits of those possible policy outcomes are a long way down the road, and that the immediate effect will be increase in prices. So yes, that's a problem, and so the question is, how will the markets react to this, and might that be a constraint that will be different than the political constraints, which, at least within the president's own party, are almost non-existent.
Well, another example of the chicanery that is going to be required to get this over the line without adding to the deficit is they're going to assume a growth rate a GDP growth rate that is unrealistic. They're going to assume a growth rate that's close to 3% when the fair estimate seems to be 1.8%, and so that allows them to cheat in all kinds of other ways. But one note that I had, Emily, when you look at the details of how they might go after certain programs, like it's they don't usually say, "Oh, we're going to cut Medicaid." One of the things that is proposed, which I'm sure will come to pass, is we're going to make people reapply more.
And work requirements.
Well, yeah. So there's work requirements, but there's also
checking eligibility of more frequently.
And so it's just making people go through paperwork more often. And the reason is not usually that these people are ineligible. Like mostly they're not trying to defraud and get Medicaid when they don't deserve it. Mostly. There are some numbers, and I'm sure there's a few billion here to be saved. But mostly the idea is if you make people have to go through the onerous bureaucratic process of recertifying yourself as eligible for a government program, you're going to deter a certain percentage of people from completing it. People who are, don't have time, or maybe their language skills are poor, or their life catches up with them. And it's kind of like the reason why gift cards are so popular. Stores love to sell gift cards because they know that a certain percent of gift cards will not be redeemed. People will lose them. And so there's a certain number of people who just simply be washed out of the Medicaid system, even though they could benefit from it. They're eligible for it, but it's been made, the paperwork has been made so onerous that they won't do it. And it's kind of ironic to me that one of the principles of, the alleged principles of this government is, we have to get rid of regulation and bureaucracy and red tape. And in fact, one of their secret techniques for screwing over people will be, we're going to increase the amount of red tape and bureaucracy so that when you try to get this benefit you're eligible for, it is just much harder for you to do it and you don't get it. And it's just red tape for hypocrisy.
Yeah, less red tape for wealthy corporations. Then you just wrap poor people in red tape so that they can't cut through it. Another thing I've been thinking about, I guess maybe this will change, but at the moment, as Doge takes off its website these big mistakes it has made in claiming billions of dollars in, quote, waste, fraud, and abuse savings that don't actually exist right now. And again, maybe it'll change. The government is not looking full of obvious waste, fraud, and abuse. It's kind of surprising, honestly, that they haven't found more things. Now, if you cut a lot of the regulations and then you simplified things, I think you could save money. But this backwards way of going about it does not seem to be very productive, which makes one wonder if all these supposed waste, fraud, and abuse savings in Medicaid and Medicare are really going to amount to very much. Also, in Medicare, you could imagine that they do exist from the point of view of the hospitals. the receivers of the money. But again, that's different from the recipients of these social benefits, especially when you're talking about poor people. Medicaid is not like a fancy, frilzy program. It's pretty basic.
The GAO last year found about $31 billion in improper payments in Medicaid. So even let's multiply that out by 10 years of the budget window, that's $300 billion. The Energy and Commerce Committee in the House has been tasked through the budget resolution to cut $880 billion. So even if you just do the math, it's obviously a lot short of that. The other problem, by the way, with the growth number is all growth is not created equal. I talked about the bond market earlier. I mean, the response from the bond market, which ends up setting the 10-year treasury anyway, which ends up affecting a lot of things like your credit card bills and your credit card interest payments and your car payments, is growth can be good, but not if it's growth that comes along with inflation, which makes money more expensive. So growth, just even though 3% is considered way on the outside, and also this gets you back to your parliamentarian, because the parliamentarian has to decide whether the numbers add up outside of the budget window. I believe it's the parliamentarian, but whose numbers are you going to use? And you can say you're going to get to 3% growth, but the question is whether the Congressional Budget Office agrees with you, and that's also something that I believe is there's a discrepancy over.
This election cycle has already been quite a ride. Scared? Nauseous? Wishing this thing had seatbelts? Pod Save America is here to help. I'm John Lovett, and each week, me and my co-hosts, Jon Favreau, Tommy Vitor, and Dan Pfeiffer break down the political news that makes you laugh, cry, and scream into the void to help you figure out what matters and what each of us can do about it. Pod Save America, the context you need for next week's news when you won't be burdened by what has been. Listen and subscribe to Pod Save America on your favorite podcast platform now.
Hey, everyone. This is Mary Harris, host of Slate's What Next podcast, where this week we're asking, did Barron Trump really engineer his dad's return to the White House?
Donald Trump has been famous for decades and has reinvented himself as a celebrity a few times. And the most recent reinvention had to do with Barron because it took place in that sort of Aiden Ross, Theo Von media sphere.
All those podcasts Donald Trump went on as he made his way back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, they're reportedly the favorites of his 18-year-old son.
We've known the guy for so long. He's still famous. He's still powerful. Barron's like the new move.
But here's the thing. In a political world that is above all else loud, we've barely heard Barron's voice. So if you want to know more about what Barron's up to, we are trying to puzzle it out. Go track down my podcast, What Next? With me, Mary Harris, wherever you listen.
All right, John's going to sit out this segment. He'll be back for chatter because his parent company, CBS, is a key player in the topics we're going to discuss, which is the Trump administration's very aggressive moves against the press. We're seeing the Trump administration move against the press in what I would characterize as three different but related ways. First, picking its coverage. So the White House announced they're going to pick the reporters in the White House pool, essentially the reporters who get to track what Trump is doing, ask him questions directly, controlling who gets to ask the questions. And they've decided to, exclude a lot of traditional sources and some of the most authoritative sources and include very sympathetic sources instead. Another example of this is barring the AP from certain White House activities, including the pool.
Generally covered White House activities, though, not just like the private ones.
Because the AP will not refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, as Trump insists. And the AP is litigating that, saying it's a viewpoint discrimination. The second kind of way in which the Trump administration is moving against the press is what I would characterize as intimidation, bringing legal action or legal threats against disfavored outlets. So there's a lawsuit against CBS that Trump is bringing for the editing of a CBS 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. The FCC is also bringing a complaint against CBS for that interview. That's a reinstated complaint. The FCC chair, Brendan Carr, who's a real Trump ally, has reinstated complaints against 3 networks brought by conservative groups. These complaints are pretty meritless, but it's a way of threatening them with the loss of their license. CBS probably will not end up losing its license on this, but it does have to fight this, or it has to find some way to either capitulate or fight or deal with it. And it's very stressful. And also, we'll get to it, but CBS is also involved in a potential acquisition, which the FCC would need to approve. And so the CBS has every interest in getting this resolved and in perhaps shading its coverage to ensure that the FCC leaves it alone. And finally, the third way in which the Trump administration seems to be pressuring the press is kind of in protection racket ways. And there's amazing reporting that X has been telling ad agencies, especially two agencies, Omnicom and Interpublic, which are trying to approve and need approval from the Trump administration for a merger, telling them that they'd better spend on X ads or else, and the or else being presumably you might find your merger doesn't happen, or you might find that your companies are facing legal trouble that they didn't know they were going to face. So this is a series of different kinds of assaults, but they're all related around this idea of constraining, limiting, causing the press to alter its behavior or to be kinder to Trump or just to not be heard as much. Which of these most unsettles you, Emily?
Which? I mean, the ones that are the most coercive, which look to me right now like the FCC, this is really troubling. I mean, it's about using one power of the federal government to try to coerce and reshape news coverage and change the behavior of these parent companies so that you're having an effect on the actual reporting, and you're telling the media that if it continues to be independent, then it's going to have problems making money, making deals, doing the things that allows the media to succeed as a business. That's a real sign of a threat to the free media. And, you know, it's obviously there are lots of criticisms to mount about the capitalist nature of media organizations, and these big companies can seem super unsympathetic. But when you think about what it actually means to say to CBS, like, we have this really spurious complaint about how you edited a Kamala Harris tape, and so we're going to loom over you with this potential threat to your license or to your merger so that you pay off the president in a lawsuit. Like, that's where we're at. Yeah.
Again, going back to sort of the similar idea to what we talked about, like a lot of the premise of, what we're doing is we want to free companies from regulation. But again, this is an example of using a very powerful regulatory authority that exists, the authority to issue spectrum licenses to use the airwaves, to compel behavior by a private company. Like, this is the opposite of liberty. This is the opposite of a free market. Like, you should not be compelled to do something you don't want to do by the threat of punishment by the state. But a licensee like CBS needs to keep its licenses. If it wants to complete its merger, Skydance wants to get it and own its licenses, the FCC has to approve it. And that gives this enormous coercive power to the FCC. And the fact that is that there, of course, has always been a power in the federal government to coerce and threaten and intimidate. And that's one of the things that Trump people complained about, was that the White House was doing that to Facebook and to the social media platforms over COVID information and over free speech issues back during the Biden administration. But that was like literally penny ante stuff compared to this, which is just so blatant and so bullying and has such a profound effect on what news organization is willing to do and can do.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm also really just distressed about is that Brendan Carr, the chairman of the FCC, this Trump ally, is using the idea of the public interest value that the FCC is supposed to promote and defend as his rationale for doing that. And, I have in the past made arguments, especially with social media platforms and technology companies, that there is a legitimate public interest reason to try to change, or if not change, at least know how their algorithms are working. And I do think the technology companies, they don't have broadcast licenses. They're in a different regulatory space. So I don't want to give up on my public interest argument in that arena entirely. But watching Brendan Carr invoke the public interest to basically either try to make news coverage more favorable to President Trump or be part of helping him win a lawsuit really shows the danger that I feel like you have talked about many times in the past when we've discussed this kind of topic generally, which is that when you give the government power over speech and the press, you invite this kind of misinterpretation.
Look, I don't think there's any doubt that if CBS litigates this Trump lawsuit to the bitter end, or,
even just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to win. They will definitely win. But it's not necessarily a risk they're willing to take. And it's exhausting and it's costly. And it is easier. Like anyone who's been at a company for any amount of times knows that the threat of litigation is worth just making something disappear, even when you're completely in the right, because it's just the mental, emotional, and financial cost of dealing with something is greater than your capacity to endure it. And one of the great skills of people like Trump, who's been a pernicious litigant in his whole career, is his willingness to inflict and endure pain. Like, he's willing to cause pain to others by bringing legal distress upon them. And a lot of people are not willing to endure it. And I while I think CBS, should litigate, and it's like it would be a terrible blow if it capitulates, the principles are hard to stand up for when you're facing this much pressure, and when you do need to get your licenses renewed, and when you do need to get your merger approved. And it's you can blame if CBS capitulates the way, what was it, ABC capitulated?
Yeah, I was going to say,
right.
The problem with this, and we saw this with ABC settling the lawsuit that was against George Stephanopoulos. The problem is that each company, when they're only thinking about their own self-interest, which of course is part of maximizing shareholder value generally, has an incentive to settle the lawsuit in this kind of context. But then there is this supposed to be a commitment to this overriding important value of freedom of the press. And every time you settle one of these pretty bogus suits, you create an incentive for more people to bring lawsuits like this. And in the past, the media has really tried to stand up and has had the backing of the courts. And there's a sense right now that all of that is in danger. And now I'd also like to bring in Jeff Bezos, who this week, the owner of Amazon, the owner of the Washington Post, made this, I thought, honestly, kind of bizarre pronouncement that from now on, the opinion pages of the Washington Post were going to be devoted to promoting personal liberty and economic freedom. In other words, only a kind of partial cut at all the issues in the world, and only a particular point of view about that partial cut. So then David Shipley, who was the respected editor of opinion at the Post, announced that he would resign. And there's just been a lot of dismay at the Washington Post about this latest turn that the ownership of Bezos is taking. And I maybe this, I just feel like there is a groupthink growing on now among these, among Bezos, Zuckerberg, obviously Musk, that is really detrimental to how we think about free speech.
I don't know. I have a slightly different take on the Bezos stuff. He owns the paper. It is 1,000,000% his right to decide what the op-ed section is doing. And if he wants to choose to focus on economic freedom and personal liberties, that is totally his right. I've always felt that op-ed sections of newspapers are weird, and there's no reason why his can't be idiosyncratic in that direction. And if he's doing it because he is trimming his sail to please the Trump administration, well, that's also his right to do it. He did buy the paper. He owns it. And I would be much more worried if I saw him making the same kind of demands of his news sections, which he doesn't seem to be making. The value to me of the Washington Post, and I think Bezos is right about this, the value is not that it is the place where the most important opinions are being spun out. The value is that it is a place that has done the most valuable news reporting of any paper except your New York Times in the past, 70 years. So as long as he is supporting those values, that to me is the fundament of the paper. The op-ed stuff is, look, I like it. I have David Shipley as a friend, and lots of people who work there are friends, and they do great work. But I do think it's a secondary business for a newspaper.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you that the news operation is more important and fundamental, but I don't think that then I don't understand being sanguine about this move in light of that, because opinion is also an important dimension of what a lot of news outlets publish. You can have questions about that and wonder about the division and like, wait a minute, isn't everybody doing analysis these days? That's a point that Noah Smith made on Substack recently that I thought was like totally worth airing and thinking through. You can have all of those conversations and considerations, but the fact is, if it seems clear that Bezos is doing this at this moment to curry favor with Trump, and that is super suspect and should make us concerned about independent media, even if he never touches the news division, which I don't feel confident about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible time for independent media because because it's very hard to find a company that feels like can operate independent of the federal government, that is completely disentangled from the federal government. Jeff Bezos's other companies have enormous business with the federal government, and this president's capacity to cause mayhem is profound. And so you can see why business owners of all sorts, whether it's CBS, whether it's Jeff Bezos, are taking a conciliatory / supplicant tack towards the Trump administration.
You can see why, and also you can fault them for this kind of anticipatory collapse of values. Jeff Bezos is an incredibly successful businessman. He could be playing some kind of heroic or just like basic stewardship role right now. I do
not think that this is necessarily signaling that anticipatory compliance and anticipatory collapse. I guess I do not think that protecting a particular form of the op-ed page, which to my mind is just like it's a blip in history too. Like
but there's what no about reason all why the other things that Bezos has been doing, like hiring? I mean, we've talked about this in the past. He's hired a publisher and an editor who seem interested in doing his bidding and not really committed to independent media. There are lots of great journalists leaving the Washington Post because they're concerned about its future. Like, this isn't in isolation, this decision he made about opinion. It's in the context of other moves that suggest less independence and less strength for the paper.
Possibly, but as somebody who reads that paper every single day, I do not see anything other than this is a really smart paper doing really smart work across a wide variety of topics.
Well, that is a tribute to the people, including our friends who work there, but I'm not sure that it means that Jeff Bezos is actually their ally and on their side and being a good corporate owner.
Yeah. Before we get to chatter, I just want to highlight a Slate podcast you might want to listen to. Decoder Ring, Willa Paskin's magnificent Slate podcast, did a new episode on Jerry Lewis's Lost Holocaust Clown movie. Jerry Lewis in 1972 made a drama about a circus clown who ends up at Auschwitz called The Day the Clown Cried. And this movie is legend because no one's ever seen it. And it has been hidden away, and people wonder, is this the worst movie ever made? Is it somehow a landmark? And the hunt to see it has been kind of an obsession. It's been a white whale of movie lovers since then. And for Willa's podcast, Decoder Ring, producer Max Friedman has dug into the legendary story of The Day the Clown Cried, how it became a just sort of epic disaster, why no one can see it, and whether it actually deserves its terrible reputation. Let's go to cocktail chatter. Our cocktail chatter. Emily, what's your chatter?
One of the many, changes in norms going on vis-a-vis the Trump administration is an announcement this week that lawyers who work at Covington and Burling, are a big law firm, are going to lose their security clearances and any government work they might have because the firm is representing Jack Smith, the prosecutor, obviously, who brought the charges against President Trump regarding the classified documents case and also January 6th. So this is revenge against a law firm for doing the most important thing that lawyers do, which is defend unpopular clients. Like, this is super basic to how legal representation is supposed to work. Lawyers don't take on the views of their clients when they represent them, but no matter what, everybody has a right to defense. And it's really important for big law firms like Covington to play that role, especially for people when they are unpopular, which is the position that Jack Smith finds himself in. You know, I was remembering when 9/11 happened, there was a whole question of which lawyers were going to defend the detainees at Guantanamo. And some big firms and small firms stepped forward, and there was the sense that, like, yes, this is the task of the legal profession. And now we're in another of those moments, like it or not, which obviously the Trump administration is just trying to kind of run roughshod over. So, you know, this is about what Covington does next. I assume they will stick with Jack Smith. And it's also about what other law firms do regarding other people who surely are going to face investigation and other legal problems from the Trump administration.
Topic for chatter. John, what is your topic for chatter?
First of all, I did my first Andy Rooney adjacent essay at the end of Evening News Plus when I do an essay, which included the...
Wait, can we guess the topic?
Sure.
Was the topic... why do they talk about whitening teeth? Teeth are already white. Is it that?
No, it's not that.
Sitting
Emily,
on an airplane? Something about sitting on an airplane?
Emily, you were right in saying first, because I do an essay at the end of every show. So I've done, I don't know, a dozen of those. So are these. But this is the first one that was even further off. It's about, it was about two alignments that were surprising. One is the planets lined up, 7 of the planets lined up in a way that was visible. And then also there was this is the reason I really was, is that super pod of dolphins. Did you see that footage? 2,000 dolphins were in a super pod that stretched out over miles. Anyway, it's gorgeous. Go watch it.
Wait, John, that's not an Andy Rooney rant. An Andy Rooney rant is like a complaint, not hey, here are some cool science things.
But I feel like the shoehorning in of there's actually a third natural wonder that was remarked upon yesterday. I feel like the weaving of 3 together is adjacent. I didn't say it was the same. I just I felt like it was somewhat adjacent. Anyway, because I know David is on a hair trigger for when this might happen. And so I wanted to kind of pre-rebut.
Thank you.
I wanted to kind of pre-rebut. However, I must say people seem to be responding favorably. So I don't think
I mean, an artful weaving together of 3 cool things. What could be more welcome?
Yeah.
Have we gotten to your chatter yet, by the way?
No, the potted dolphins was the preliminary part, because the second part of my chatter is incredibly depressing, which is that a quarter of New York residents don't have enough money for staples like housing, food, and they can't, do things like go to the doctor. And this is according to a new report the research was done by Columbia University and Robin Hood, which is the anti-poverty group. And basically, this is connected to our conversation about the budget, because they found that the reason that the increase in poverty in New York spiked so much was the expiration of the government aid that was expanded during the pandemic. This was also a different methodological measurement of poverty, so it took into account not only income, but non-cash support like tax credits and also the local cost of living. So it was more precise than some of the other poverty measures. Anyway, so obviously if this is happening in New York, there's, it's happening elsewhere. It may not be as acute, but this is if 25% of a city can't afford essentials, that is It's an extraordinary statistic.
Before I get to my chatter, two quick bits of informational log rolling. First of all, we're hiring at CityCast a new executive producer to run CityCast DC. So if you're somebody with podcast experience who's interested in local news here in DC, we have an amazing job working with a super duper team. It's a great podcast, great newsletter that you'd oversee. So you can look that up at citycast.fm/jobs. Second, in the same vein, I'm going to be, if you're in DC on March 11th, Tuesday, March 11th, I'm going to be talking at the Cleveland Park Library about local news. Love to see you. I'm very excited to talk about this sort of resurgence in local news. So Tuesday, March 11th at the Cleveland Park Library. Come join me. And Amanda Ripley is going to interview me, my favorite person in the world.
President
More
Company
than you
excluded.
love us, your favorite.
Really?
Yeah,
Come on.
maybe that's not true. Okay.
Oh my
Yeah.
God!
Among your
Or my
favorites.
children, my three
Yeah,
children.
your children, your girlfriend.
My girlfriend, my
Familiarity
mother,
breeds
my brother.
contempt, obviously.
All right. Excluding that group of people. Amanda's my favorite. But anyway, Cleveland Park Library. But my actual chatter is a really delightful article by David Owen in The New Yorker this week about this moment in 1968 when Jimmy Page and his band, the Yardbirds is a legendary band, which Eric Clapton was in and Jeff Beck was in, and then Jimmy Page was in. When the Yardbirds played prom at St. Xavier High School in Cincinnati. And the Yardbirds, this was sort of a few weeks before Jimmy Page left the Yardbirds and formed Led Zeppelin. And they, sort of were in the Midwest playing, and they, bands needed gigs, and they ended up playing this prom, this proto metal, heavy rock band played the prom at this all boys Catholic school. And it's just about what happens when future rock legends play a prom. And it was great. It was a really, really fun story. And also David Owen then talked about how he didn't realize that his own high school was exceptional, because at his high school in the 60s, Ike and Tina Turner had played, the Drifters had played, the Crystals had played, Booker T and the MGs had all played their high school. Like, can you imagine going to high school and like Ike and Tina Turner play your high school?
Oh my God.
Crazy.
Yeah, didn't happen. Didn't happen for me. Listeners, you have also sent us chatters. Please keep them coming. Tweet them. Don't tweet them to us. I can't even believe that note is still in my notes here. Tweet, that verb. I don't even know what that verb means. Just email them to us at gabfest@slate.com, something you are talking about at your cocktail parties. And our listener chatter this week comes from Mike Zhu in Rochester, Minnesota.
My chatter is about an article in The Athletic entitled "Canada's Mind-Boggling Goalie Crisis Has Been a Decades-Long Descent." This article looks at how Canada lost its edge in producing world-class goalies, from over 70% of the NHL in the 90s down to less than 30% today, with factors ranging from increased competition due to an international goalie arms race to a hyper-competitive youth hockey culture that discourages innovation. Most of all, I love the tone of this article. It reads like an indictment of the US healthcare system or manufacturing policy or some other huge societal issue, including a lament that Canada spends so much money on domestic goalie programs, yet sees such poor results. Though, of course, if you're Canadian, hockey is a huge societal issue. Thank you, and love the show.
That's all for our episode this week, but we will have a bonus episode in your feed. We do have a bonus episode in your feed, and it's about some really interesting and troubling death penalty cases out of Texas and sort of legal events that occurred around them this week. That's only for Slate Plus members. So if you are a member, thank you. Enjoy it. If you're not a Slate Plus member, consider joining. You get lots of great stuff. You get these bonus episodes on the Gabfest, bonus episodes on other shows. You get no hitting the paywall on the Slate site. So do that by subscribing to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week. Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. I didn't even say the name of the show right. I said Gabfest. Here we go.